Hi, this is Patsy with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and for everybody who wants to know the story behind the book. And today I have a wonderful guest, Jung Chang. And I cannot tell you how many times I have read Mao. And, it's a big book. I'm going to show people that this big book is a very important book.
Mm,
I think that it's so important that we know more about China. It can be an important friend and it can be an enemy, but we need to know about China. I wanted you to be able to just talk about it and explain
mm,
what we should know about China. Plus, I just want to tell everybody
mm.
you were awarded the CBE. Wow, that's
Yes, it's Britain. Well, thank you.
that's impressive. So, how did that feel to get that?
Well, I feel wonderful. Of course, I feel great, particularly because the honor was awarded for contribution to history and to literature. Um, and so I feel very honored.
Tell us about this book, Mao. I think it must weigh about 3 pounds. Tell us about your husband and how you got involved in writing the book.
Well, this is in the early 1990s. My previous book, Wild Swans, Three Daughters of China, um, had been published. And that's a story of my family, my mother, my grandmother, and myself. And of course, after the publication of that book, I had this great interest in Mao because Mao basically dominated my early life. I left China. I grew up in China. I left China after Mao died, age 26. And Mao dominated the country, dominated the population, dominated my family. And he is an extremely important man. But I felt the world knew astonishingly little about him. And there are many questions for me as well. And so I embarked on this project with my husband, Jon Halliday, who's a historian, Irish, half Irish, half English. So we started writing this biography together, and it took us 12 years of research and writing. And I think finally we really got to know who Mao was.
Well, you certainly did. We learned things in this book about Mao that are incredible. Your research, the depth of your research is fantastic. I've always been interested in China. When I was little, I wanted to be Chinese. I was reading Pearl S. Buck at the time, and
Yes.
I
And
fell in love
um,
with China, and I even tried to learn how to write Chinese. So my interest has
mm,
always been very deep. When you wrote Mao and I read it the first time, I was so shocked. I didn't, of course,
mm,
nobody in America knew about most of this. This is
mm,
such an eye opener. Nowadays, there's a great deal of interest in Mao, but I want people to have the proper books to read about China. The reason I decided to contact you 6 months ago, I was watching television. There was a protest, and I don't know if it was in America, England, France. Anyway, they were
mm,
protesting, but there was one guy wearing a Mao t shirt. And I thought, it was at a university. I said, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Why
mm.
are you wearing a Mao t shirt? There's some horrific stuff in this book that is frightening. But let's go back a little bit. What do you want to tell the world about Mao and what we should know about him?
Well, I just really wanted to tell the world, if I may say, what he was really like. I mean, I didn't, although I grew up under him and I experienced life under him, and there were many, many things, incredible amount of things I didn't know. I think after 12 years of research, I think I can say the most important thing we need to know about Mao is that Mao was responsible for the death of over 70 million Chinese in peacetime. I think that's the most important thing the world should know. And our book is very thick, it's full of notes and figures and specific facts. Um, and so I'm waiting for you to ask me what are the specific things you would like to know.
First of all, why weren't Americans, particularly Americans, aware of this, of what was happening in China? I checked with some older people, people who were interested in the news back in the 50s and the 60s, and they were watching the news, but none of them knew about any of this starvation. They thought everything was going great. People were starting to own their own land, and the misconceptions. How did this happen? How did he control propaganda all the way back to when he started?
Well, he didn't. I mean, there were some, willing victims and people who were there doing their apologizing for Mao. And after Mao took power in 1949, China was completely isolated from the outside world. And so it's not surprising the average Americans don't know very much about him. And I think two people did most for Mao's image in America. One was Edgar Snow, an American journalist. And of course, he was disillusioned with Chiang Kai-shek's regime. The regime before Mao, there was a lot of corruption and incompetence. And so he just had this illusion about Mao. And he was a brilliant journalist and wrote very well. So he did tremendous favor for he did tremendous he basically gave the world a benign image of Mao, more than benign, but a kind of shiny image for Mao. He was from the left, and then Mao had another cheerleader, and that was Henry Kissinger from the right. Henry Kissinger visited China in 1971, yeah, and then followed by Richard Nixon's visit. Um, and that
And here I
sort
have a
of
picture
gave
here of
Henry,
them
yeah, oh, you
meeting.
have this, Nixon, okay. And that visit brought it didn't open the door of China, but it gave people a glimpse of this isolated country. And so they gained, incredible prestige. So Henry Kissinger then described Mao as a philosopher. And he particularly said, Mao's sitting room was lined with books, like a scholar's study. But one thing he didn't know was most of those books were looted by Red Guards in 1966 to 1967. And the owners of the books were beaten up, some were beaten to death, and those books were then put into official storage. And Mao sent his staff to select the books he wanted. He gave them a list of the books he wanted, and those books were then came to line Mao's bookshelves. But of course, Kissinger was not to know this when, at the time when he wrote those words, that Mao's sitting room was like a scholar's study. But when he did know about this, I mean, after the publication of our biography of Mao, which exposed these facts in 2005, and after numerous personal memoirs testifying the horrors, the suffering and death under Mao, Kissinger still was keen to be Mao's cheerleader. And as late as 2010, yes, 2010 or 2011, he went to China to celebrate the Chinese Communist Party's 90th birthday, 2011. and he attended mass rallies with the people, tens of thousands of people there singing propaganda songs about Mao. So he continued to blow Mao's trumpet, and he did a great deal to resurrect Mao for the mainstream West. And then, of course, in between, there are these academics, Western academics, particularly American academics, who were supposed to be the experts on Mao. But I think they just close their eyes to the facts they don't want to see. And they really helped the Chinese regime prop up Mao's authority and perpetuate the myth about Mao being a great leader. I mean, today, the Chinese regime is resurrecting Mao's personality cult in a huge way. And it's written into the law that whoever that said disrespectful things about Mao would be given prison sentence. And I know sculptor who in the 1980s, after Mao's death, made some sculptures sort of deemed offensive to Mao, and he was living in America. He went back to China to see his family, and he was arrested. So with all these powerful support, it's not surprising the average American still doesn't know who Mao really was.
That's a shame of it because they really need to know. One of his greatest talents was using euphemisms. He would come out with all sorts of words and ideas for torture, the things, the terrible things that he did. Maybe we'll start with Edgar Snow because Edgar Snow really also was responsible for all this propaganda that he was doing great things for China. He was a people's person. He loves the people. He would never hurt anybody. All of this nonsense. I still don't understand why during the
Well,
takeover.
Well, no, he was not there. The book in the 1930s, before Mao came to power, and
But
because
he,
Chiang Kai-shek's regime was corrupt and inefficient and was, well, not great. They made Mao's job a lot easier. And Edgar Snow was not surprisingly, um, um, he not surprisingly disliked that regime. So he placed his hopes on Mao and the communists. I think people of his generation, a lot of people like him, were the honest ones. Later, were very disappointed and became supportive of Chinese dissidents. I know Edgar Snow's second wife, Lois Snow, was one of them.
let's start at the beginning. Mao was against capitalists, he was against landowners, but tell us about his own lifestyle and how he got to this
Yes.
point.
Well, I mean, he Mao was from a family which under Mao would be deemed rich peasants, rich peasants, um, and um, he was against the sort of landlords and capitalists, I should say, not out of his own beliefs, but because that was the ideology, the communist ideology. I mean, his own lifestyle was incredibly corrupt. I mean, he, of course, didn't have a Swiss account. He didn't have gold tabs, the things that usually associated with wealth. But he had the whole of China, the money of the whole of China was there at his disposal, and he could do what he wanted with the money of the entire Chinese. And Mao indulged himself very much. For example, he loved the villas. So he had at least 50, far more than 50 villas constructed in all the provinces and the places he went. And I myself visited many of those. And they were all in the most beautiful places of that area, and the building itself was constructed for security. I mean, it was always one floor because Mao didn't want to be trapped upstairs. But the one floor was as tall as two floors, and they were all. In some villas, the car basically drove into the sitting room, and the steel doors were closed before he got out because he was so worried of being assassinated. Um, and that was one indulgence. And he was a gourmet. There were special farms, I mean, making food for Mao and the other leaders, communist leaders. And Mao, there were many details about the fuss he made for food. He loved one particular kind of fish from Wuhan in central China. So a plane was sent whenever he wanted to eat that fish to go to Wuhan to get the fish, and flew the fish back to Beijing. There were too many examples like that. During the famine, when about 40 million people died of starvation, and Mao publicly said he would share the troubles of the population, and he would not eat meat, and which was really a lie, because we found a menu in Mao's possessions when he died. And that was made in 1961 at the height of the famine. And it was at that time that Mao developed a fancy for meat-rich European cuisine. And that menu of dozens of scores of dishes were designed for Mao. Well, I mean, he's got these quirks. For example, he had a dressing gown which had dozens of patches. So this was used by the regime to show what hard life, restrained, puritanical life Mao was leading. But far from it, Mao loved that dressing gown, and whenever he needed patching, the dressing gown will be flown all the way to Shanghai from Beijing to be mended by the best craftsmen, to make the best patch. I mean, just incredibly more expensive, costing incredibly more than an ordinary dressing gown. His life is full of these things. I mean, he was and also, for example, he didn't have gold tabs because he never took a bath. He never washed, took a bath or take a shower in the 27 years of his rule. And he didn't didn't brush his teeth, and he didn't have a shampoo, but he loved his barber to scratch his head. When you're slightly itchy, to be scratched was quite pleasurable. He liked that kind of pleasure. And he had girlfriends or bodyguards to rub him with hot towels instead of taking a bath. So those are the quirks of the super rich and the super powerful. And Mao was like that.
Well, going all the way back to the march, um, he didn't actually walk. I don't remember how many miles it is.
It was 6,000 miles.
And everybody thought
And
he walked it.
Yes, well, far from it. I mean, we now have quite a few memoirs of Mao's friends, and also people on the Long March, who wrote about Mao sitting on the what do you call the litter, or some call it sedan chair, where he could recline. And in fact, a old friend of Mao's wrote that Mao said to her, when she went to see Mao, Mao said to her, I'm going to be carried. Look, this is what I have designed for myself, which was like a reclining bed made of bamboo. And Mao designed a warning, so he could be shielded from the sun and the rain. And he said, actually himself, he said, during the Long March, I had nothing to do, lying in the litter. What did I do? I read. I read a lot.
He liked to dance. So tell us about that part of his life. He liked
A
entertainment. He liked.
dance. Yes, yes. I mean, Mao was not a good dancer. Yes, he liked dancing. So in Zhongnanhai, the compound of the leadership, and there were dancing parties on Saturdays. I mean, even in the Cultural Revolution, when nobody else dared to dance in China. And dancing, Mao regarded as a way to exercise. Um, of course, dancing is a good form of exercise. And the other thing is he used it to pick up young women. Because for those dancing parties, dancers and singers from the special, what they call song and dance troupe, the women were bussed in, and Mao would pick them up and make love to them in the room that was adjacent to the dancing floor. And dancing floor was just separated from the dancing floor by huge, thick velvet curtains. I mean, everybody on the dance floor knew what was going on in that room next door, but of course, nobody dared to say anything.
So how
I
many
mean, yes,
wives?
only one person. Sorry, only one person, Peng Dehuai, who was Mao's defense minister. But before he was purged, when he spoke up during the Great Famine against Mao's policies, and one thing Mao held against him was Peng said this one particular one, song and dance troupe, was formed as Mao's harem.
So how many wives did he have? He had some official wives.
Well, I mean, he had numerous girlfriends, but he only had four wives. And the first one was by arranged marriage before Mao was even an adult. And she died early. And the second wife was Mao's the love of his life. And for our Mao biography, during the research, we had this tremendous scoop, which was we discovered in the manuscripts, letters, poems, diaries, which she left behind, hidden in her house. And from these documents, you could see that Mao had abandoned her. She was madly in love with Mao. And Mao loved her as well, but Mao didn't hesitate to abandon her and their three young sons. What I found most inexcusable was that she died because of Mao, because she was executed by a Kuomintang general. And Mao could easily have saved her by letting her know she was in danger, and even just send somebody to take her out of that place, and their three sons. But and Mao was nearby. I mean, he even passed by the house, and we went to see the house and the road where Mao marched. I mean, it was incredibly close, and he could easily have saved her. And but he didn't lift a finger, and so she was executed, and the three sons were orphaned, and
And it
were
was
later sent to one died, and the other two were sent to Russia. Stalin gave them education, but also kept them hostage in case he wanted something from Mao, and Mao didn't want to give.
and it was a horrific execution. It was
Yes,
terrible.
the second wife was really terrible. I met in my interviews, I met their Mao's best friend who actually rented the house for Mao and the second wife. Um, and she was very attractive, and from her writings you could see that she died in 1930, and her writings were really ahead of her time. um, and she loved Mao, and she was loyal to him, um, which was when which shows when the Kuomintang general asked her to renounce her relationship with Mao, and if she did that, he would not execute her. But she refused, and she'd rather die and orphan their three children than doing something which she did regarded as not honorable, as a betrayal to her love. So it was really quite um, quite a dramatic story. It showed that Mao was obviously very attractive for somebody like her, extraordinary like her, to love him so much, so passionately. But also he was completely heartless in how he treated her. Um, and also, of course, this is not a place to get into it. And of course, because Mao was, no, let's not get into it. It's a very long and a very beautiful story. Not beautiful, I mean, it's a tragic story, um, but it says a lot about Mao, who
Well,
he was, a complete heartlessness.
yes, and what I didn't understand, and well, of course, she's writing these poems to him, she's writing these love letters to him. Now, he was already killing people, doing terrible things to take power, as he was eliminating all potential enemies so that he could rise in power.
Mm.
She didn't know what he was.
Well, the thing is, she died in 1930, and at that time, the first bloody major purge, when Mao killed tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers and officers who didn't obey him, didn't want to obey him. I mean, that was yet to happen. So she didn't know about that. But of course, Mao, by then, Mao had been living a life like a bandit. I mean, they robbed people, robbed villages, and killed what they regarded as reactionaries. I mean, she read about those in the newspapers. And one of her pieces was saying how she loathed the violence and atrocities, and she wanted to tell Mao about her feelings, how because of this violence, she'd lost faith in communism. I mean, that particular letter, which wasn't sent, of course, she had no place to send it, because Mao's address was uncertain. What she didn't know, and she said, I give me a faith. Give me meaning a new faith. Give me a new faith. I want a new faith.
So you mentioned communism. When
Mm.
was explain his communism compared to the Russian communism, and how did they sort of get together or not get together? between?
Well, I mean, they are basically from the same root. I mean, Mao, there isn't an independent Chinese communism. The Chinese Communist Party was founded by Moscow in 1920. And at that time, Mao hadn't said he believed in communism. So he was not one of the founders. But then Mao, got a job from the founders of the Communist Party to open a left-wing bookshop in Changsha in Hunan province, which was Mao's home province, and to sell left-wing and communist literature. At that time, China was completely free. It was actually a democracy, which is something also unknown to the world, but I wrote about it in one of my books, The Three Song Sisters. China, for 16 years, China was a functioning democracy, and it was in that period. And Mao loved reading, and he was poor. He was working as a freelance journalist and a school teacher at the time, and he needed money. So he opened a bookshop. And his friend I interviewed for a Mao biography, I say mine and John's, for the Mao biography. Was the manager of the bookshop, and this was how Mao got involved with the communists. But once he was in the party, he realized that this was ideal to him, because unlike a democracy or democratic party or liberal party, which had to take in what people wanted, the Communist Party was a dictatorship, and basically all decisions were made at the very top by a handful of people. And Mao was very good at manipulating a small circle of people around him, and so it suited him very well. And that's how he got involved, how he became a communist. It suited him. And under Stalin, when Stalin was alive, the party took orders from Moscow. All their documents were sent to Moscow, and Moscow gave them instructions. And there were tons of documents about their relationship. There isn't such a thing as an independent communist party before Stalin's death. But of course, Mao was constantly disobeying Stalin because he has his own interests. I mean, he didn't want to take orders all the time. So they had clashes. But Stalin also felt that Mao, as Stalin said to the Yugoslavs, Mao was insubordinate, but a winner. Stalin could see Mao had this extraordinary hunger for power, and he felt that Mao was the best person to lead the tiny Chinese Communist Party to power. And indeed, Stalin was very smart. Mao was indeed that person.
How did that lead to the Red Guards? It's very
Now,
hard for
what
me to
the
understand how terrible it got in China.
there were a lot of atrocities before Mao took power, 1949. And after 1949, there were various very public violence and atrocities. I mean, for example, the land reform, earlier you mentioned that, and that was very violent. It was about land, but any communist state would take over everybody's land. I mean, there isn't such a thing as a private ownership of land in a communist country. And so the so-called thing of letting the peasants have their land is a lie. And during the land reform, in order to generate the kind of terror to get people to obey him, because Mao's rule was about to rule by terror. He had his way by terrorization. So that's why in the land reform in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, a lot of so-called landlords and rich peasants died, were beaten to death, executed, and driven to suicide. So the Red Guards didn't come until much later in 1966 when Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. The previous years of communist rule was bad, but you know, the Cultural Revolution was really horrible. I lived through that and I knew it. In my school,
How old were you then?
teachers,
How old were
I was
you?
14. I
14.
was
So you
14 in 1966. I was in my second year in the middle school. And the Cultural Revolution started. Mao ordered young people to join Red Guards, to form and join Red Guards. The Red Guard is not like a communist party. I mean, it was all these sort of youngsters getting together and calling themselves the Red Guards. They didn't have a tight organization, and it was a rather loose organization, but they all took orders from Mao. And Mao told the Red Guards, be violent. So in my schools, a gardener was condemned as a class enemy and was beaten up, and he died soon after. And I saw denunciation meetings against my teachers. And I I witnessed one teacher being beaten up by pupils, by her pupils, because she had been dismissive to them in class before. And not only the teachers were made victims, children from so-called undesirable backgrounds were also made victims. Basically, under Mao, far from the society being an equal one, the society was divided into many categories. I mean, if there is a form, whenever we have to fill in the form, after name, sex, date of birth is class background. And everybody was slotted into a class background. The ones from an undesirable background were called the blacks. And the ones from the like a communist background were called the reds. And during the Cultural Revolution, the Reds, children, bear in mind they're all children, like children in my school, and the Reds were licensed to torment the Blacks. And one night, a girl who was designated a Black threw herself out of a window. And I was in the distance, and I caught a glimpse of that. I can, it's sort of the horrible image just stayed with me all my life.
I
Okay, those things were done by the Red Guards.
so
But as but of course, most of the Red Guards were just ordinary children because we were brought up um, um, under Mao, and we were told Mao was like our God. And if we wanted to say what I say is absolutely true, we would say, I swear to Chairman Mao. Um, so when Mao asked young people to join Red Guards, and every child in China wanted to join, but only a small amount of people committed violence and atrocities, but they terrorized the entire school, entire city, and entire China.
so this is what's so incomprehensible. So he
Mm,
got these children to be against whatever he wanted them to be against. And then at the same
mm.
time, he was also destroying. When did he start destroying old monuments or buildings? Um, from
At the same time,
at the
as soon
same
as the
time,
Red
right?
Guards were formed, yes, Mao's goal was to, in starting the Red Guards, was to generate terror. School teachers and the children from the so-called black background were not his real enemy. His enemy was actually his party, the Communist Party, who he thought most of the party officials had stopped obeying him. But of course, Mao had a, in a way, I mean, he smelled right, because the party officials had turned against him. And the reason was this great famine in between 1958 and 1961. About 40 million people died of starvation. And the cause for the famine was that Mao exported food to Russia and to Eastern Europe in exchange for military industries, to make him a military superpower so he could dominate the world. I mean, China's ambition, or Mao's ambition to dominate the world, didn't start just now. It started as soon as Mao took power. He had this ambition. But of course, in those days, China was poor, um, and was embargoed by America. And so Mao could only get these military industries from the Soviet bloc. And he didn't have much money because China was poor. But so he squeezed the money out of the Chinese to pay for those expensive military industries. And that's why 40 million people died of starvation. And Mao knew these people would die if he started what he called the Great Leap, which is a great leap into industrialized and militarized country. And he knew people would die. And he even said, for all his projects to take off, maybe half of China will have to die, which is incredible, just absolutely incredible. And so even his party officials were against the policy, and because they themselves and their families were starving. And so even Mao's number two, Liu Shaoqi, who was a pretty hard man, otherwise he couldn't have risen to being Mao's number two, even he was against the Mao's policies. So they got together and tried to stop Mao's policies. And they indeed stopped Mao in 1962. That's how the famine stopped. So Mao hated his officials. He particularly hated his number two, Liu Shaoqi. And Liu Shaoqi died of a horrible death in Mao's jail in the Cultural Revolution. And all those officials who followed Liu, who got together with Liu, became targets and suffered horrendously. But Mao, through his cunning and calculation, he regarded that he couldn't just purge all these people in one go. His words didn't have that much, that kind of magic. So he generated this great terror in China first, so that the Red Guards can do his terrible things for him. And this is why Mao started the Cultural Revolution in 1966, formed the Red Guards, generated tremendous terror, and then before he turned to his real targets, those communist officials, from January 1967. And indeed, he was able to purge all of them. So I hope that was clear
Yeah.
to you. That was what the Cultural Revolution was about. It was a bloody power struggle. and Mao's revenge against his number two and against those communist officials whom he purged.
The kind of brutality, the kind of torture, it really is mind boggling that there were so many people who were involved in it, killing people in
Mm,
horrific ways.
mm,
He
mm.
personally enjoyed this kind of thing. Did he participate in personally, or just ordered it, or what? What kind of a
I
person was he?
I think physically he was not violent personally. There is no record of him beating his wife, beating up his wife, and that sort of thing. But there is evidence that he enjoyed watching his enemies being tortured. I mean, the denunciation meetings against his number two, President Liu Shaoqi, were recorded for Mao, and Mao watched the video in his villa. He certainly, um, I think the killing, certainly the sort of awful atrocities certainly gave him some kind of visceral pleasure. I mean, this went back to the 1920s when he went to Hunan and um, went around the countryside, because at that time there was a lot of peasants being stirred up to kill landlords and kill rich people. And before Mao went on this trip, he was rather moderate. Um, and he was against those awful, violence and atrocities. But after he went there and did a tour in the province in 1926, he was completely changed, and he found that he actually liked those scenes, horrible scenes. And he described in that book the report on the Hunan peasant movement, which it beats me that the people who are supposed to be Mao specialists read as about peasant movement, about land redistribution. I mean, there's not a word about land redistribution. They were full of scenes of violence and atrocities, and Mao clearly was fired up by those things, and he then became very radical. No, radical is not even the right word. He then became very extreme, and the slaughtering I was just mentioning later, particularly in 1930, 1931, against an organization called the AB, which we documented in our Mao biography, and about which there were also tons of original documents. And the torture, the forms of torture were horrendous. And of course, in the Chinese society, there had been a ghastly, cruel tradition, I must say. I mean, just think of foot binding, crippling women's feet. My grandmother had her feet crushed and bound, and I saw my grandmother's feet when I was a child. Only the big toe was allowed to grow. The other four toes and the arch were crushed under a big stone, and the binding was there to stop the broken bones from recovering. And my grandmother lived in pain all her life. And she told me that if people say you would get over it, but you would never get over it. Um, so so there was that tradition, to subject half of the population to that daily torture. It's incredible. Now,
But
by the
somehow,
way,
between the torture, the starvation, between all of the things that were going on, including uh, the Vietnam War at that point, and yet nobody knew on this side of the world. Nobody understood the really ugliness of it, the horrific nature of it, or how horrible he was, because he's a horrible person.
Yes, well,
what
I'm
went on?
afraid America got a lot of things wrong, and China was just but one of them. Well, the thing is, um, even though the country was isolated from the outside world, the denunciation meetings were very open. They were around every street corner. I mean, in the schools, and people were beaten. My teacher were beaten, were subject to denunciation meetings in the open. Um, I mean, of course, nobody was there. There were no Westerners to see it, but there were many refugees, and from South China, and people risk their lives swimming to Hong Kong, and I know some books written in the 50s about their personal experience, and which when I read them when I was writing the biography of Mao in the 1990s mainly, I mean, they were as truthful, as revealing, as all the things I have seen and experienced myself, but the world didn't want to listen to them. And I would say the so-called China experts didn't want to listen to them, didn't want to believe them.
That's what's frightening. That's why I think this book is so important. I just wish everybody in our government would read it, and all the professors, because they can't sort of hide behind, oh, well, he's trying to give land to the peasants. I've heard this now from so many
Which
people. I mean, I have talked to
you
people.
know, which is absolute rubbish, because he didn't.
No,
He didn't. The China's land was what they were given at, for one day. I
yeah.
mean, then they were immediately taken back. I mean, which land during under Mao belonged to the people? I mean, private land, private houses. I mean, all these people. I mean, why? I can't understand. Well, I can't understand why how they can be so dishonest.
Well, I don't understand it. And well, you mentioned Kissinger, and you mentioned some other, but so many politicians who never paid attention to all the reports that were coming out of China.
Yes, and also if you read any Chinese memoirs, I believe there are a lot of personal experiences about their lives in China. I mean, not a single one, I would say, can find any nice, kind, decent thing to say about Mao's rule.
And reading about the Red Guard and all the things they were tearing down, the old buildings,
Mm,
they wanted to get rid of everything old.
yes.
I still don't understand how even
Why
then the
Mao
world
would
didn't.
do that?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it is. Well, this is destruction is something in his character, I must say, and he always said, Destroy first, and the construction would come out." Which is, I mean, his pseudo philosophical saying, but there is something destructive in him. Of course, I'm not psychoanalyzing Mao. I mean, I'm just observing these facts. And the other thing I observed was Mao had basically was scornful about Chinese culture. I mean, he particularly didn't like Chinese architecture, which is why the Chinese architecture has basically been wiped off the face of the earth. I mean, in China, there were these sort of sites for tourists, maybe given a sign by UNESCO or someone. They were all, I mean, I dare say the buildings, there was a town I visited. I mean, it was really built with the help of bulldozers, destroyed all the old houses and build a new town, and being pretending to be old. And Mao, he had this um, terrible he despised the Chinese culture itself. And of course, that Mao came from an era when the Chinese did despise themselves, despite the Chinese culture at the beginning of 20th century. And they want to emulate the West. That's fine. But you really don't have to you don't have to destroy everything Chinese. But Mao was he didn't have any pity, any care about Chinese things. I mean, when he was rebuilding Beijing, and Beijing was an old imperial city with many palaces, temples, city walls, and gorgeous architecture. And Mao ordered them destroyed during the Great Leap, and he particularly ordered Chinese architects who were against this destruction of Chinese building to take part, to torment them and to break them and to break their dignity, to break their ideas, their mind, to change, to wash their mind, as he said.
Wow.
And of course, he wanted to his population to be unthinking, uncultured, basically like draft animals, mindless, to do what he asked them to do, because we know that culture is a civilizing fact, is a certain civilizing thing. I mean, it's very important to have culture. But Mao wanted to deliberately wipe out the culture so his people would be stupid. He had this policy of making people stupid. 愚民政策. It even has a Chinese name. And it's also beats anyone's imagination that for 10 years we had no books. I mean, all the books were condemned as poisonous weeds, and they were summarily, burnt, pulped, and all for some special books that Mao wanted to read, or his cronies wanted to read in Beijing. They were sent to Beijing to be kept for them. It's just this man is so extreme, so bad. I mean, he's even criticized Stalin. He said Stalin made a mistake. He allowed Russian and European classics to survive, to be read, and it had very bad consequences. When I was there for the whole 10 years, I knew we had no books. And I myself, I was very lucky. I was able to read hundreds of books. And this was because I had a 13-year-old entrepreneurial brother who discovered a market selling books, the books that had escaped the bonfires of the Red Guards, because some Red Guards, after raiding people's houses and took away their books, they sold their books on the black market to make some money. And owners of the collections were afraid of being beaten up, because the Red Guards often beat them up for owning the books. So the owners sometimes sold their books as waste paper to be pulped, or sold them to the black market. And so my brother built up a collection. He loved collecting stamps before the Cultural Revolution, but collecting stamps was condemned as a bourgeois habit. So his interest then turned to this elsewhere, like he collected the classics of Chinese and Western classics. And he also collected the Mao badge. I mean, in those days, we all had to wear Mao badges. So there were over 1 billion of them, of different shapes, materials,
I've got one.
and quality.
I've got one.
Sorry,
I have
you
one of the
got one.
badges. When I was in Europe, I found in a flea market.
Yeah, but though in those days we all had to wear them. So my brother, there was also a black market dealing in the Mao badge, and my brother made a small fortune dealing in the Mao badge. He became a connoisseur, and so he used the money to buy books, and I was able to read the books he bought and hid ingeniously, and so I was able to keep my brain from being dead. But for 10 years, China was a cultural desert. No books, no theaters, no cinemas,
Oh my.
no museums. Um, it was through all this, he brutalized the whole population and made China such an awful place, uniquely awful place under his rule.
In
Actually,
burning
look at
books.
North Korea. Look at
Yeah,
North Korea, which
exactly.
learned a lot from Mao. I mean, you get a mini version of Mao's China.
Before I let you go, tell us a little bit about your husband
Mm.
and how you met him.
My husband, as I said, is a historian, Irish, English. He, we met in London. Mm, we met in London. We met like many other people met, and we embarked on this biography of Mao together. Um, and we divided our work by language. Because I'm Chinese, so I dealt with the Chinese language sources. My husband knows many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. And in particular, he knows Russian. And so he spent years working in the Russian archives, which turned out to be a treasure trove because all, as I said earlier, the Communist Party's documents were carried by messengers or later sent by radio transmission to Moscow, and there was a huge archive there. And we were very lucky because when we were doing our research, it was the 1990s, and Yeltsin was in charge. And Yeltsin opened the door of the Russian archives. And many archives or many collections have since been closed by Putin. But we were very lucky. We caught that window of opening.
Oh, that's
And
good.
John did our research there.
They've more or less locked it up again.
Mm.
Ah, so what is your message that I know that you're promoting this book and of course Wild Swans, which is your personal story and your family's story and working on a new book coming up. But what are your goals? I mean, what do you hope for people to understand about China?
Well, I just hope they can take away some facts from my book. I mean, I'm not a message-driven person. I mean, I didn't write a book to tell the world a message, and I follow evidence. I love research. I love research in the archives. I love research in documents. I love interviewing people, and we have interviewed a lot of people in America, including Kissinger himself, and also George Bush, the senior, who was head of the liaison office in Beijing after Nixon's visit, and many other people, and Edgar Snow's contemporaries and people like him. Um, we 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 I love doing all this. I love collecting evidence and draw conclusion from this evidence. And I would like my readers to see the facts and draw their own conclusions.
Have you ever spoken to our Congress, to the people in Washington D.C.?
No, no, no. I'm a writer. I do my own things. I mean, um, you know, as you mentioned those two books, but after that, I wrote two other biographies. One was about the Empress Dowager Cixi, the last great imperial ruler, a woman who was the real person who brought medieval China into the modern age and was the woman who banned foot binding, which was often credited by people who claim to know China to Mao, which was a total injustice. And she was a great woman. I wrote a biography of her, the concubine who launched the modern China. And then I wrote a group biography of the three Song sisters, Madame Chiang Kai-shek and her two sisters. And of course, along with them, I wrote about Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Yat-sen. So I think I basically completed a trilogy, apart from Wild Swans, a personal story, a trilogy of biographies of modern China and its most important characters. And and now after that, I'm coming back to Wild Swans after 30 years to bring the story of my family and up to date.
You mentioned Madame Chiang Kai shek and her sisters. They were on the cover of Time, and Madame Chiang Kai shek was very popular in the United States. She was very big in Washington, D.C., everybody knew her.
Yes. Well, I think that was because it was during the war and China um, had been fighting Japan for many years alone. And then after Pearl Harbor, when America joined in, and America suddenly realized, you know, China had been heroically doing all that, and actually under Chiang Kai-shek, her husband. And so they gave her an incredible welcome, including addressing Congress. Um, and so that was she was at that time she was being a good first lady in China's war against Japan, but at the same time she was corrupt. She loved a super luxury life. Um, so Chiang Kai-shek's regime was incompetent and corrupt, which made Mao's conquest easy.
I want to thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a thrill to talk to you. I have been promoting both books actually, but particularly the Mao in the recent years because I think it's so important that people know more
Mm,
about China, understand the possibilities.
mm.
We want a world at peace, but we have to understand everybody. So if people don't understand, there can be no peace.
You're right.
Certainly, Mao is an amazing book, and also the it has an
Mm,
audible version for people who think they can't lift 3 pounds. But and you can also
mm,
get it on Kindle. It is a
mm.
marvelous book, and your other books are equally great. And here is your website. People can go there.
Yes, it is. Yes,
Yeah,
it is. Yes.
yeah, yeah.
Mm, mm.
Jungchang.net. And you have more information about all of your books. And I hope that people will go there, find out more about you. And if Madam Chiang Kai shek could speak to Congress, I think you should be invited to speak to Congress because they could
Well,
learn a lot from you.
thank you very much.
You're so lovely. It's such an honor to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining me today
Thank
on
you
Joy on
very
Paper
much.
Live.
Thank you. I, I
Okay. Bye bye
thank
now.
you.
Bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye. It was an honor to talk to Jung Chang about Mao. You know, we are in difficult times and we need to know more about what's going on in the world because if we understand it, then we can prepare for it and we can perhaps do the right thing. Please subscribe, click that button, and just subscribe to Joy on Paper Live. Thank you.